Hello everyone and welcome in today's PCB webinar. My name is Gzim and I am the account manager for security portfolio at PCB, also the organizer of this webinar. I think you all know that PCB organizes daily webinars in our 5 portfolios, and every week we will have a webinar on security portfolio covering different topics and areas. In today's webinar we will hear about creating trust for the Internet of Things. Compared to other webinars, in this session there will be 2 of our presenters, Mr. Craig Spiezle, who is the Executive Director of the Online Trust Alliance, and PCB partner, Mr. Scott Perry, who is principal of his firm called Scott Perry CPA, specializing on cybersecurity. I hope you will enjoy this webinar and find it very informative. If you have any question, you can write them in question box in right-hand control panel, or you can use the option to raise your hand, and we will answer to all of your questions accordingly. Please, Craig, you may continue now.
Good morning and welcome, and thank you for providing us the opportunity to speak with you today. I'll very quickly provide you a little overview of who we are, and then we'll jump right into the core issue today that's, I think, addressing and concerning organizations throughout the world, and that's the environment of the Internet of Things and how it impacts our lives, our security, our privacy, and long-term impact. So very quickly, the Online Trust Alliance, we're a nonprofit organization that works globally, and our mission is very simply to advance best practices, policy, and efforts to really enhance user security and privacy. And we believe by working together through multi-stakeholder efforts, convening different parties, that we can achieve these goals while also promoting innovation and confidence for users and organizations of all sizes. To that goal, we're comprised of a very broad range of organizations here, from retailers to alarm companies to data analytics companies to marketing companies. So all in all, there's over 100 organizations and that provide us through funds and donations that help us really provide this very objective and sound point of view, and at times voice of reason. We also work with a wide range of organizations internationally, and such you'll see the ITU, International Telecommunications Union, to IACRT, which does international consumer testing, to other think tanks and working groups and trade organizations. But again, the whole point of these slides are to show really how we really work and how that really helps provide frame our position and really these best practices that we're going to share in the next few moments here. So one of the key things that comes down to, people quite often will ask me, is why do we care? And really the IoT is becoming very, very pervasive. I think everyone knows the reports, whether it's from Intel or Cisco, the number of devices that are out there. But the real concern is what consumers are saying. And this is some data here that we have from Pew Research Center that was released in December of 2015, and really talking about consumer control. And if we look at just internationally right now, what's happening with Safe Harbor and Privacy Shield, there is a huge international concern of data that's being collected and what choice and control do we have right now. So I think that's pretty well understood. What's interesting is Accenture released research in January this year, very specific to IoT, and basically saying that almost half of respondents, and they interviewed 28,000 people in 28 countries combined, that really point to security and privacy are obstacles to keep them from using and acquiring and purchasing products. So that's a significant concern right now. And if we go to the other element of this is again the number of consumers, that again lack of service guarantees that impact them. So Craig, those are very, very key issues that we need to be addressing as an organization, and that we're working on those. And so those really sum up very quickly why we think these issues are so paramount there. So Scott, I'll kind of turn it over to you right now.
Appreciate it. So if you could just hang on the slide for a little bit. Good morning, everybody. I'm Scott Perry. I'm glad to join PCB in this great webinar series. If you look at why are we here today, connected home devices and wearables are mainstream now. They're one of the most popular holiday season purchases. They're expected to grow to 50 billion devices by 2020. Because of these devices deal with personal information, the public gets concerned. You can see on the slide, they are rejecting the fact that they want control of their information. And so they want to hold these IoT manufacturers accountable to provide their services in a responsible way. So if you can go to the next slide. This is what we're seeing every day in the newspapers and in blogs. Baby monitors have vulnerabilities, connected kettles in London, wearables, even Barbie is getting hacked. I mean, where's the world coming to when Barbie gets hacked? These innocent-looking devices, they create potential backdoors into home networks. And there really doesn't appear to be efforts to stem the trend. Next slide.
Yeah, I'll add to that. One of the points is that we'll be talking about is it's the security and privacy of the devices, not just when they're shipped, but the long-term impacts of them, how they support it, and we'll get into that. But again, unfortunately, and I have to agree with Scott, is on a daily basis, there's yet another device that seems to be making headlines.
So even White House staffers in the United States has concerned, and it really, government entities and the public at large spurred OTA to take action. Because OTA represents a broad brush of multidisciplinary viewpoints, they felt they could come to bear and create security criteria for these devices more quickly than international standards bodies. And at the end of the slide, I want Craig to share his experiences in working with ITUT regarding the fact that when we put out this IoT Trust Framework, we did it in such a fast manner that the standards body took notice, and the fact that we could get action together, get the viewpoints together to come up with a set of security controls to address this threat a lot quicker than the standard channels that were available. And so we came all together starting at the beginning of last year, and our focus started on connected home and wearables. The issues in those devices are very personal. They're getting into your home, your daily life, your individual behavior. There's IoT devices in a lot of other areas, but they also have oversight in regulatory industries such as the automotive industry and the medical industry, as well as industrial IoT devices. So we decided not to focus in that area and focus on areas that was wide open and really needed to be addressed. At a minimum, we wanted to come up with a code of conduct so that IoT manufacturers could stand up and say, we are going to follow these generally accepted principles that IoT has come up with. We are looking for a certification scheme, and we'll talk about that in a later part of this presentation. So the focus is around 30 digestible principles dealing with security and privacy, not only just initially, but sustained over the life of the device, which is very key to some of these devices. You have to make sure that the controls that are put in when you start them up are maintained throughout the useful life of these devices. So Craig, we're talking to a bunch of folks that work with formal standards bodies, and I'd like you to share some of your quick experiences with working with ITUT, which many of the audience members may have access and experiences with.
Yeah, well, thanks, Scott. And actually, years ago I worked very closely with IETF, and my career, 14 years at Microsoft, worked on standards issues here. There are certain roles of the standards and the path where standards organizations, I think, are very, very important. Obviously, connectivity, wireless standards, USB standards, and such. But you hit something on really key, is the issue of the very personal data and this rapid race to market and the escalating security and privacy concerns. And you mentioned earlier about the White House and the U.S., and clearly this is an issue of, you know, one weak link can create a very large impact downstream. And we're very concerned about the long-term impact of how not only cyber criminals can compromise devices, but the scenario in which a state-sponsored terrorist could compromise hundreds of thousands of homes with a known vulnerability, compromise coffee pots. But you know, you may think in isolation that's a very small thing, but again, the diversion of first responders to fires and such could be really catastrophic. Understand that optics, we actually were approached by multiple standards organizations to share what we're doing and to participate. And so the ITU, based in Geneva, that's the International Telecommunications Union, has actually provided us membership. They've flown us out twice now to speak. And there's other standards organizations that are doing the same thing in different arenas. I think one of the things that's really unique is the different parties that have come together. For example, in North America, we have one of the largest school districts that's now a member of the working group. And that's a good example of someone who would not normally participate in a standards organization. Their concern is the 100,000 students and how they may be bringing devices into their network. They're concerned about their teachers. And so really they're looking at it from the whole network standpoint. On the other end of the spectrum, again, to show the diversity, is we have what's the National Association of Retailers, of Realtors, excuse me. They represent over 1.2 million realtors in North America. So again, they're concerned about the smart home issue. So I think these are the issues that we've been so successful, is we're getting people on the ground that are dealing with real issues, as well as the privacy advocates on one side and security architects on the other. So very diverse group, but it's really helping us to come up with these controls that are obtainable and are very much needed in today's environment.
So one of the key challenges within IoT devices is that when you purchase a Fitbit watch or you get a thermostat in your home, you're not just getting the device. You're getting a complete support and monitoring network that stands behind it. And that network gets communicated through Wi-Fi in the home or through other communications with mobile applications that are connected with it. And so that creates an extendability of the device and the supporting infrastructure that all needs to be related to each other and secured in a consistent way, because if you don't, it creates vulnerabilities. In addition, the collection of all the data from these devices creates a personal signatures to the person's behavior, which really deals with privacy challenges.
Yeah, Scott, one thing I think it's also the challenges is that there's lack of market barriers today. I mean, everything that we continue to see, just when we think we've seen the last type of device, another company comes out with some other thing that has connectivity. And one of the challenges is a lot of the off-the-shelf tools that are being used, firmware and such, that are helping bring this rapid innovation in products to market, but also the lack of understanding what's behind those tools. And just yesterday, there's a vulnerability came out with an open source patching software tool. So again, creating man in the middle of attack. So it's all these issues. And when you buy a device, you have a device that's interfacing with an application on a mobile device that then is using data in the cloud. So from a testing and certification standpoint, you can't just test the device like you would have a standard toaster. You really need to look at the whole flow of the data, from the data point, the sensor that's collecting the data, where it transmits, to the back-end cloud service if there is one. So these are challenges that we've recognized and have been working to try to address.
So if folks read the individual principles, you'll find that they're pretty standard for larger scale software manufacturers. The challenge within IoT is the fact that usually the software is firmware, and these manufacturers have never had the opportunity or the rigor placed upon them that larger software manufacturers have. And so the application of those types of standards, easily implementable maybe for larger manufacturers, are of great challenge to these new and non-traditional vendors. Thanks, Greg.
Yeah, I might add to that is when we say standards, they're not necessarily technical standards. Some of them are just best practices that aren't being recognized and adopted. And those are the concerns that we see here. And so as we went through this, we really came back to just, controls, best practices, and processes that need to be put in place to help better protect these risks from occurring, how to detect them, and how to respond to them. So those are all key issues. Scott, you mentioned earlier about the data, and I think I want to just really point out is that a good example is on the privacy side. Privacy side isn't necessarily thought of in the standard community as well. Security controls are. But the concern that we have, and I have on what I've termed as ambient data collection, is the risk of all these sensors out there that are collecting very personal, very dynamic data. So a wearable technology, sensors collecting information about that user, but it's also saying where that user is. And that information in the wrong hands today may seem very innocent or what I call benign, but when you combine all of these different sensors and data, and you know what someone's lifestyle is, in the wrong hands, it could certainly be embarrassing or very harmful. So that's the challenge of privacy, and so we really, one of the major pillars that our working group has been to focus on those areas of the data collection, and are we really thinking about it? And one of the concerns that OTA has, and I specifically get concerned about, is more and more IoT business models are based on data collection. And so we need to make sure that consumers have the right notice, the control of their information, control of the sharing of their information, and also what happens when they no longer use that device, who owns that data. So those are the issues that we started to look at as an organization.
Yeah, I think, if you look at the last bullet point on this slide, you have to just take into account the fact that as I mentioned earlier, that there is projections of 50 billion of these devices going out in the marketplace. So today, the signature of your personal behavior is very limited because there's not as many IoT devices out there. But if all of these devices are going to be connected to the internet, there's going to be a tremendous amount of data that will provide a signature of your behavior. And that's a new threat that hadn't existed before that can be exploited.
Right, and it could be not only your privacy, it also could actually cascade into your personal security. Now others are able to see when you come and go from your house, what your patterns are. Very good time. They might be able to detect, is your alarm system armed? And these are real life scenarios that are happening today. So on one hand, it's great you have alarm on, but if I am able to compromise other devices in your network and detect it is armed, that's great information for the burglar. And the converse of that is, as we know, the data from major alarm companies have shared, most users, 75+% do not activate their alarms. So just an example why we're concerned here. So this we've tried to give you a little bit of a setup of the challenges and problems that we have been dealing with and approaching. And as Scott said, that we've been working together about a year now. And so our goals are relatively simple. we really want to help the developers, manufacturers, and industry to help reduce the vulnerability landscape and also adopt what I consider responsible privacy and data security practices. We think that we have an opportunity collectively and everyone on this call to really push these principles or controls forward to create ideally an enforceable yet voluntary code of conduct. In the absence of that, you have two challenges that will occur. You have one that's already happening, and as Scott reviewed, on the concern of consumer remorse and concern, and that brings on the call for regulation. And we know in that scenario that stifles innovation. But ultimately, we really believe we want to see companies step up to the plate and embrace them and recognize them and give them positive affirmation. Part of that is the ideal scenario is security and privacy becomes part of a value proposition of a product or service. So these are some of the goals that we have. Obviously, international has been a real part of this. As we know, data flows internationally. And again, one of the things that's been very compelling is how we can share best practices, and through the different stakeholders that have been involved, it's been very insightful. And our goal really is that this framework and set of controls can actually be used against and create a certification program. But one of the challenges I mentioned is you certify the device, the mobile app that it connects to, or the back-end service, or all three. And they're very dynamic. It's much more dynamic than a typical web page or a typical product you buy. So what's interesting is, as I mentioned, we've been working for some time and we have a very diverse group of stakeholders. This framework's already in use, and it's used in 3 different areas today. A version of it has been used to help realtors look at some of the considerations in buying and selling a smart home or smart apartment. And again, ultimately, we've come up with this view that in this new day and age of connected homes, you need to re-provision your home when you buy and sell it. All these devices. And lots of concerns that came up, and right off of the framework, for example, who owns that data? How does a new homeowner get contacted and reset or get patched a device? So that's one area that's been already in place, and that was in October a few months ago. And then in December, working together with the working group, we published a list of criteria for consumers to think about on all the devices they were getting and acquiring and gifting over the holiday period. Again, trying to leverage this criteria. And the third area, which isn't listed here, is a major international retailer with over 1,700 retail locations is now using a version of our checklist to audit or survey, I should say, vendors who are selling them products. So in other words, before making a decision to merchandise and put a product in a store, retailers are now using versions of this list to help understand what is the security practices, what's the privacy, what is the long-term support strategy. We know the product warranty may be 90 days, but what is it, are you going to support it over the life of the product? So we're seeing some great momentum in those areas. Scott, did you have anything you wanted to add to this?
One of the things I wanted to say is, because I know a lot of people on the webinar, are involved with standards organizations like ISO, and I was a representative of the U.S. delegation to ISO for security standards for a while, and I was concerned about the speed of getting technical standards and guidance out to the marketplace, because the trends were moving so quickly, and the slow pace of these larger standards organizations to respond to that really was alarming. And so when I became involved with this effort with OTA, I was really refreshed in the fact that we could put something out at a very quick time turnaround to address market trends that were happening as they were doing it. We tried and we were successful in getting this smart device purchase and setup checklist out before the buying public were looking for these devices. And I think that that was very important on how, standards organizations need to respond to security threats and to provide guidance to the consumer public.
Great. I think one of the things too, understanding, and I think we're going to now jump into it, is that we're not talking about developing new standards. What we're talking about is evangelizing existing standards and talking about the context and importance of that and how these need to be applied. So, and that's one of the reasons of our agility, I think, and then also understand the urgency here. When again, the number of, just over the holiday period, over 50 million smart TVs were going to be sold. What are the considerations? So that urgency and that agility, I think, have been key areas.
Okay, so
go ahead, Scott.
I think, yeah, so wanted to just give you at least a projection of what the standards look like, and we encourage you to check the link in the bottom and visit the OTA site and learn more about not only just the framework, but we have a resource guide attached to that, and there's a lot of other information that you could definitely benefit from looking at the OTA resources. But this is a snapshot of the actual framework, and we're going to go into individual items that we wanted to pop up, but this is the how it looks like. Each one of the security principles are kind of short, digestible, action-oriented, and identified as either we felt is required or recommended, or maybe not applicable, dealing with the connected home and wearable technology. We also wanted to organize it in different subset categories, and we looked at security mechanisms, user access and credentials, and privacy, transparency, and disclosure. So companies can look at that and organize it, and I would recommend that all of you download that and look at that, look at the individual principles and see how they can apply to organizations that you work for and work with. Any other points, Craig?
Yeah, I think so we have this in the, you see the 3 columns here, and right now for the most part everything is the same between the connected home and the wearable technologies. We envision as this evolves and V2 or V3 comes out, this will be dynamic, that there may be some scenarios so some of these criteria are more or less relevant to the connected home or the wearables, so we recognize that in this area. And I should also say is that we posted yesterday a companion resource guide to help provide context, resources, explanations for each one of these. But to Scott said, what we tried to do is how could you measure each one of these and whether it's something you would test with a tool, would this be an assertion from an executive of a company, but it was really areas that we were saying measurable. And at one point, we were at over 90 some criteria, and in over about a 6 or 7 month time, we really whittled that down to 30. And I think one of the key points here is we have to be cautious, as in the standards environment, that perfection is not the enemy, it does not become the enemy of good. And we had to look at the realistic environment of a device that's on your wrist, the technology, the battery life, certain cost parameters, and we try to be really pragmatic. That said, we do expect this to evolve, but we think, we need to have this baseline out there.
Yeah, and one of the things that I, as an audit professional, added to this framework is to ensure that all of these items had demonstratable artifacts or evidence to prove that that the manufacturers trying to apply these could actually demonstrate that they're in compliance at a reasonable level. And I think that that was key as we look at the code of conduct for acceptance as well as bringing in outside parties to assist in the audits and attestation of the standards. So let's take a look at some. We picked out a few that we wanted to talk about in more detail, things that we thought were more relevant as it relates. I think they're all relevant, but I think we can have a lively discussion and questions and answers regarding individual principles that we're talking about. It starts, with the device. I mean, we're talking about, an IoT device, and the device from a large, if you're looking at a small device, it has a certain amount of cost, thermostat, wearable technology, and the importance is that the data that exists on the device, as well as the data that's communicating to its extended network, remain encrypted. It's not in clear text, in transit, or on the device. And this becomes a cost concern for manufacturers because they only have a certain amount of space that they can put into firmware on the devices, and encryption adds cost and complexity, but it's absolutely critical to the overall view of the vulnerability of this particular application. It only takes one hole in the fabric of this communication to create a true vulnerability, and these devices have been noted to have those. Also, the encryption vendors, they're also starting to take notice, and they're offering encryption certificates specific to IoT devices. And so that creates an avenue, but manufacturers aren't always in control of all of the data. So they need to extend the encryption beyond their device to other related parties that are holding data on their behalf.
Scott, it's interesting. A report just came out yesterday from Cisco, again, identifying yet some other, and again, more home thermostats that could be hacked and controlled here. And again, that's a combination, to a lot of what you talk about here is, well-established companies that now are creating and adding connectivity, and again, that some are missing some of the fundamentals. So we're constantly seeing that as a issue that's ongoing, and I think we'll see more of it. So again, that talks about the device security to its core.
All right, if we can go to the next principle we want to talk about. So, vulnerability reporting. These manufacturers are racing to get IoT devices out into the marketplace. And the question really comes down, are they doing enough testing? Or do they really can understand all of the vitals of their individuals? And the question is they're not. So they need to be receptive to how the general public is using the device and finding their own vulnerabilities within them. So they need to do their due diligence to collect the vulnerabilities from the public, because in many ways it's really the final layer of the product testing. Also, the company needs to be plugged into the sharing of vulnerabilities in the marketplace. And even the government has gotten involved in that. And actually, I think that's one of the major U.S. governmental initiatives is around really moving forward on the communication of vulnerabilities between government and commercial entities. Because, in items like, we cited in Snapchat, there were many vulnerabilities in one of the applications of Snapchat called Find Friends that came to the forefront, and the communication back to the manufacturer really made it a large difference.
Yeah, if I can provide some added context to this. So what we're really talking about is having a vehicle which a researcher, a consumer, or other can actually report to a company of what they believe is a vulnerability. Increasingly in the United States, the Federal Trade Commission is looking at this. If a company fails to have this, is a raise of concern, and they now consider this from a legal perspective reasonable and required security measures. And specifically what happened in the case of Snapchat, a researcher found what he believed to be a vulnerability. He made contact with the company finally responded to him 30 days later and dismissed him. And at that point, the researcher went public and disclosed the logon credentials of over 1 million users. And that was an example that they had dismissed them, they didn't timely respond to it. So this is an area that every company needs to have, and whether this is set up through an email alias, there are companies that you can use for managed vulnerability reporting, and there's other tactics to support that, such as bug bounties. We don't recommend those or discourage any of those. Well, here's the example again. The requirement or the control is have a process to receive and track and respond to them. How you do that is different for every company based on your size, the market you're in. But clearly this is one not only in control here, but this is something that's very quickly becoming a legal acid test for companies when a vulnerability is exposed. And to that point, the NTIA, which is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, has stood up a working group on vulnerability reporting, which the OTA is part of. So again, a key area that I think every company needs to have in place, and something not only have it in place, but staff it, manage it, and respond to it appropriately.
So if we look at updates and patching, these products are not static. They require continual modification, really, as industry, marketing, technical variables change, and IoT vendors need to respond. And so the way that companies update patching is absolutely crucial to the security posture of the device, because the latest trend is for malware providers to get free legitimate code signing certificates and inject their virus-laden code within the manufacturer's firmware. And so it is absolutely important that the authenticity of the source code running on these devices must be established and verified. Because vulnerabilities such as that were found in Nest for thermostats and Vizio for TV manufacturer software found that they could compromise with the introduction of malware that allowed hackers to access Wi-Fi in the home. And so it's absolutely critical that these manufacturers ensure that updates and patches come solely from their source and is bona fide and verified as coming from a trusted source.
Yeah, there's a few elements on that to kind of drill down a little bit. There's one, having a system in place that pushes out those updates, and understanding that many of these devices, let's say a connected garage door and such, may not have the typical UI. So we have to think about how you're pushing those down and how do you notify them. So that's one part of it, and especially as people move on from a house, how do you update those other devices? Signing of that firmware or patches are really important, so it's not again compromised or someone is trying to use social engineering, which we'll get into another area. But we're seeing all these areas, and also testing your patches. And the examples here with Nest was not about someone taking over the control, but their software patch actually disabled their device. And the remedy of it was not very intuitive for someone who is not very technical. You had to remove the device from your wall, you had to plug it into a USB charger, you had to charge it, and the issues went downhill from there. The point is, your heater no longer worked in your home. And if you were in an environment where all of a sudden your home was now 40 degrees, that could have a major impact. In the case of Vizio, again, unsigned patches opened up a man-in-the-middle attack here, again, that weren't fully tested. And as a result of their system on there not requiring sign patches, through some testing, actually ransomware was able to be deployed and installed on Visio systems. So again, to think about the whole life cycle, how you do patching. And just yesterday, there was a major open source software patching solution that was actually found to have vulnerabilities. So again, this whole life cycle that you need to look at, just because you're getting something off the shelf, what vulnerabilities does that have in your supply chain? So key issues to consider. Scott, did you want to touch on breach preparedness, or?
Well, I thought you had more data that you could share with that.
So absolutely here. So as Scott mentioned earlier, every one of these principles and controls is very intuitive to someone in the security field. But many, if not most, of the new IoT devices are not coming from security companies. They're coming from consumer product companies in a whole wide range of areas and solutions. Tremendous innovation. But they're also collecting data. And so one of the fundamental parts is, if you're collecting data, you need to assume you will have a breach. And a breach isn't necessarily your systems being hacked. In some cases, it is accidental posting or information that is visible in the clear. In some cases, it could be simply an accidental disclosure or a lost file. In fact, in our research that we just released 2 weeks ago, and part of our data protection and breach readiness guide, first of all, 91% of the breaches that occurred in the first 3 quarters of 2015 were preventable, and over 30% were due to consumer employee missteps. Not necessarily rogue employees, but lost files, lost devices, posting, different things of that nature there. So I think the key here is assume you will have a breach. And again, the best defense from a consumer protection standpoint and from a legal standpoint is have a very thought out and tested breach response plan that can clearly articulate what you're doing to prevent it, what you're doing to help detect it, what you're doing to help mitigate it or control it, and last but not least is how are you resolving of it. And getting back to that earlier slide about the ambient data, as you think about the sensitivity of the data on wearable technologies, you think about the baby monitors or other devices in your home. From a consumer perspective, the sensitivity of that data is significantly more than just their browsing habits. So this is something, again, more and more countries, the EU, the Data Protection Directive, and others are requiring companies to have developed, tested, and employees trained on how to respond. And so again, this guide, 60-page guide that we released just 2 weeks ago, provides you a tremendous amount of tools on every element, from doing risk assessment of your data providers, your cloud providers, to data breach cyber insurance. So key areas to consider, and I think again a great resource that we're able to provide.
Yeah, I think one other point is that if we're assuming that breach will occur, and the word breach brings out, global media and such, we have to come up with, better messaging around, how companies can prepare, because we're assuming that vulnerabilities will be discovered. And so they need to have a plan for reality for vulnerability management and the large B in breach. And we need to have the messaging and communicate it to companies to respond appropriately based on what their responsibility is in the various degrees of exposure.
Yeah, and to this point, the last thing you want to have is when you have an incident, and you will have an incident, and assume it, and that's why we say plan for reality, is to be able to say you do have a plan in place to respond to third-party reporting. Your last thing you don't want to have to explain in the press is, well, yeah, I guess some researchers did try to send us email, but it went to a junk mail folder and we never looked at it. Is not a great response here. And by the way, as you look at the slides, this is number 15 out of 30, so the numbers on here don't refer to the slide number. It's refer to which one of the controls. Let me kind of, so as we're coming up top to the hour here, very quickly touch on privacy disclosures. And it's really what's unique about these devices today is how do you find out about the data collection and data use processes or practices of a device. You buy a TV to watch a TV, you don't necessarily expect it to be watching you, and again, to have to accept the terms when you're trying to watch that show, when you're installing the device, isn't really the time of when a consumer should find out about it. So we believe that device manufacturers need to come up with a clear, discoverable method for consumer to find and review these disclosures prior to purchase. So it's not when you're unpacking and first installing the device. And that's a sea change, because everyone says, well, we're going to put up a user a window and they have to consent to it to use it. Well, we don't think that's the right thing to do, and so we believe it needs to be very much articulated in a very concise, staccato manner. So some of the ideas, for example, could be a special fact sheet on the side of the box. It could be QR codes, but other methods. So again, we're not saying what method, but we think this is very, very important that, again, this disclosure be made. And it's now becoming more and more of a legal requirement. Now the challenge is you're buying a smart watch, there's next to no packaging, so how do you have that? So one idea that we would love to see is a standard QR type code that would be put on, and a consumer at any time could say, find out what is the privacy policies. But what we don't want to see is just become a model of it links to that 50-page document. It should have a very clear, concise, we collect these data attributes, we share it with these partners under these circumstances, your rights to blah are here, and if you don't agree or consent, these features of the product will not work. We think that's good business, and we think it's good for your customers and the industry at large. And this is perhaps one of the biggest ones that's demanding regulation right now. So again, that's why we want to get ahead of the curve here and really talk about it. And that very much ties to this slide here, which is a combination of two slides that really talks about, again, the disclosure of this information. And again, what we believe is, again, the default setting should be no data is shared with third parties unless it's specifically for the delivery of the services of the product or services, and such third party has no rights to use that data for any other purpose other than providing for that device manufacturer. So there's a lot of details in this area, but ultimately, again, we need to make sure that we really are giving consumers control. Conversely, if you are saying that we collected your data in order to offer you services, that's a position you can take as long as that's very clear and articulated, and the consumer gets some value from that. And the reality is we know consumers' data has a lot of value, and so these are the big concerns we have. So Scott, for the sake of time, I'm going to kind of hand it back to you, and then we can do a wrap-up here.
Okay, great. So one of the challenges we were looking at is how do we move past a code of conduct and actually get into an accreditation scheme. So what this slide shows is a generic model of how criteria is subscribed to by companies, validated by auditors who provide assurance to relying parties. So independently and indirectly, relying parties can get comfort from vendor ascribing to criteria. And so I call this a referential trust, because you're not trusting the vendor directly. You're using a model indirectly using auditors working with accreditation bodies and audit accreditation bodies to provide comfort to indirectly to relying parties. And it's, it's a scheme that is very familiar to a lot of people on this webinar, because it's how ISO works and other accreditation schemes typically work. Now, how can we apply this to IoT? If we go to the next slide, we really need individual components to be actors in this model. We need an IoT accreditation body to create an update and take responsibility for the IoT trust framework that IoT vendors would ascribe to, and in order to do that, we need an audit accreditation body that has attestation standards and criteria and the ability to accredit security auditors that would go and work with IoT vendors who would provide them evidence of their procedures and operations and their technology functions in order to provide comfort to the IoT accreditation body that would eventually, be communicated to consumers, so they can say, oh, they passed a certain, a independent review of this criteria, therefore I have comfort and some assurance that I am buying a product and from a company that has shown due diligence and is subscribing and applying the trust criteria. And so we're at the point where we have defined what we need, but we're seeking external parties to be actors in this model. So, Craig, maybe you can talk, to sum up really where we're at and what's next in this effort.
Great, Scott. And I think, again, providing that overview of a scheme, where we are on that, and, what we see ourselves and what role we play as an organization, it's evolving. And so one model could be like we are the, setting what these criteria are, and there are third parties that are licensed and such and approved to do the testing against these things. So lots of models that's evolving, and we certainly welcome that feedback. So what's next? In the very short time period, in the next few weeks, we are going to formally release the framework. It's still in draft and last call, as well as the reference guide that we've mentioned. And actually, I'm going to just toggle very quickly, and you should see our website in just a second here. As it says, waiting for next screen. There we go. And you'll see on here that you can download the guide here, and again, you can open up the draft framework. It's in final call right now, and the framework as well as a resource guide. And the framework is exactly what you saw it before, as Scott shared and walked through. Each page walks through all of the criteria and such in there, and still posted as a working draft. So I encourage you to review that. And then we also released yesterday or earlier this week a resource guide, about 16 pages of content to really walk through some of the criteria and providing a little more context, resources and such out there. And so again, with the resource guide we see will be very dynamic going forward. We certainly welcome your feedback to that. There's ways to contact us, which we'll share here. So that's where we are in the immediate time frame. Let me go back to the slide here in just a second here. And just bear with me. So again, so that's where we're at right now. We are looking to have this, the first point, as a voluntary code of conduct. There are several companies that are talking to us. One of the challenges is that we have great amount of support. There is concern of how do we kind of come out and say we support this, but if our products currently don't support it, what's next? And so what we're really looking for is companies to say that they embrace these principles, these controls, and over the next 12 to 18 months, they plan to adopt them. Our slides on, we talked about collaboration. We need more collaboration. There's other organizations. We don't want to be reinventing the wheel. We've had good collaborations with groups like Build It, Simplify, I Am the Calvary, as well as some other organizations. We've mentioned the ITU. We would like to look at funding for a pilot project to kind of get this out there, especially on the certification and testing side. Incentives, I mean, really this is about, we want to see companies that adopt get incentives and positive affirmation and get recognized for their attempts to move forward. So those are key areas that we want to do. And then again, this framework then becomes that baseline for recommendations. So we have lots of resources. I encourage you to consider some of them out there right now for our organization. As I mentioned, that we're an open organization that any company can join, whether you have 100,000 employees or you have 2 employees. We have a very flexible model. But these are the key resources. Everything that we showed you on the IoT working group, our resources are up there. They're public. We also have more about the data protection guide. I encourage you to do that. And there's some other areas that we're very focused on as an organization, is how we talk about IoT, but for example, malvertising and malicious ads are also an attack vector. So those are some of the areas and resources for you to consider for us here. So I'm going to hand it back for questions from the audience right now.
Okay, thank you, Craig and Scott. We have a few questions. I will read them. You will be able to respond. The first one is, what will the word trust mean to things on IoT?
Great question. You know, trust is really the foundation of everything we do in our digital lives and in our personal lives. And I think trust is having the confidence that the device is working as it's intended, and I have full disclosure, and that it gives me a peace of mind that it's not just trustworthy out of the box, but it will be through its life cycle and through its end of life. Scott, what's your view on that?
Yeah, so I mean, the challenge is when I'm using a device, I want it to work the way it's intended, and I don't want to expose myself to any negative aspects, such as the intrusion of my personal life. And so that's really where I'm establishing a relationship with the manufacturer, because they're making a connection to me very personally. I'm attaching it to my wrist. I don't want the trust that I'm creating when I'm buying a product to be violated just because I did that and exposed myself. I expect that trust to be maintained through the life of the use of that device.
Okay, the second question is IoT going to lead to too much data to manage, or we just have to accept the future as it is?
Well, I do sometimes think there's a technical answer to that and there's a personal answer. I think in a very thoughtful perspective, I do wonder, do all these devices need to be connected? And what is the value proposition? But it seems to be the business model, if you don't have a connected device, you know, it's not viable. So So I personally have a smart home where I have chosen to disable some of the devices. In my case, I didn't see the added utility of value, and the other, I just made that risk assessment. I wasn't convinced that the companies had a holistic security and privacy view. These are established companies that are known, but again, they're traditional companies. One was a garage door opener and one was a gate. So I personally made that decision. I don't know if many consumers are that educated or aware, or perhaps I'm just more paranoid. I don't know, but those are the concerns that we have as this rapid race to market. Do we really need these devices? And I do fear that with more and more headlines between data breaches on one side and these devices with known vulnerabilities, what is that impact? And it gets back to that earlier slide, is that going to really impact the growth of the market? And it's interesting because many companies say, well, look at this great growth. And I come back to, well, maybe the growth could be 2 or 3 times higher than it is, but we don't know. We don't know what is the real baseline to look at because of getting back to trust and concerns. Scott?
Well, a quick question, because I think the proliferation of IoT devices kind of map the introduction of e-commerce 20 years ago, where the utility of doing online banking and buying things on the internet was just, you know, the utility of that was very attractive, and people did it despite the risks or despite the knowledge that the risk existed. And it took 20 years, you know, more and more e-commerce applications to reach a point where the using public got worried and concerned and said, hold the phone here. So you're always going to introduce risk before you have measures to address it. The question is you need to make sure that the window between introducing new risks and countermanding that remains at a reasonably short duration.
Hey, Scott, you actually mentioned something really key there. You know, 20 years ago, it's like everyone was just adding .com after their business name and saying, you know, that was the market. You had to have that. Everyone was pitching new products. And we know a lot of those companies went out of business. And that's kind of where we are today, but now it's just now have your device connected. And there is that concern is what happens on the war of attrition, so to speak. You have these devices, the companies go out of business. And then what do you do? And obviously, if it's a $20 video camera, it may be a big deal. But now, if you're installing a $300 thermostat in your home or other devices, it's certainly concerning. So again, looking at those long-term things in this rush to market is certainly a concern.
Well, I want to thank PCB and thank Craig. I've enjoyed the opportunity to speak to the webinar today, and thanks again.
Great, and thank you. And again, if you have additional questions, you can see the contact information. We can route those questions to Scott, myself, or others. Again, and if you're interested in getting involved with the working group, again, we welcome your participation. So thank you again, and thanks for the leadership of PCEB for really facilitating this today.
Okay, thank you, Craig and Scott, for giving us this highly informative presentation. I believe the attendees had the chance to learn many new things today, and I suggest you to take time and see our future webinar that we will be hosting. Next Wednesday, we will host a webinar topic which is called ISO 27001, Control A17, Continuity on Information Security, and ISO 22301, Confusing Our Relationship. Thank you once again to all attendees.